Dan Pashman, welcome to Longer Tables.
Hey, Jane, thanks for having me.
I'm very excited for you to be here because I am a fan. But for listeners, maybe the two listeners out there who don't know what the Sporkful is, could you please describe to us what is the Sporkful?
So, the Sporkful is a food podcast that I launched back in 2010 in the stone ages of podcasting. And we like to say it's not for foodies, it's for eaters. I'm not a trained chef. I just really love food and I love to eat. In the early days of the show, it was mostly me nerding out on and obsessing about the tiniest details of the eating experience. And in recent years, as the show has evolved and grown, we've used food to get into a wide range of different types of conversations, getting to know people better by talking about food, getting into history, culture, identity, science, economics, pretty much anything. So we cover a lot of different kinds of topics and have a lot of fun doing it.
So, one of my questions, which you just referenced, was your tagline, which is it's not for foodies, it's for eaters. And I'd like you to explain that distinction to me and why you think it matters.
Well, I should look. It's a catchy slogan. I don't want it to sound. I'm not against foodies. Like it's fine. Probably in some ways, maybe I'm a foodie, but it's really that. Especially when I first started the Sporkful, I'm still not a trained chef, and I found the world of food media somewhat alienating for a person who just is really passionate about eating. A lot of it is about, and a lot of the world of food is very much about status. What restaurants have you been to? What chefs do you know? What chef is at this place? Did you go to this chef's place? And all that. And I just don't really care
Yeah,
about
it's
those
so
things.
precious and
I know.
virtue and status signaling. It's not really about the
Yes.
food.
Right. That's exactly right. And it's not a competition to see who's eating at the most fancy places. And so that's really what I was responding to. When I say it's not for foodies, it's for eaters. It's for people who just love to eat, the kinds of people who like I'm the kind of person who wakes up in the morning and is looking forward to my meals that day and goes to bed at night thinking ahead of what are the meals for tomorrow. And those are the however good or bad a day is going, I know that I have those bright spots to look forward to. And like, those are the people I wanted to make a show for.
Right. It's very funny because that's actually the way I describe myself to people too. I'm waking up, I'm thinking about food when I wake up in the morning. I'm thinking about it when I go to bed. I can say that truthfully, the only time where that was not fun was sort of in the depths of the pandemic. And I know nobody wants to talk about the pandemic anymore. Like, let's just be done with it. But, when you woke up and you were like, oh my God, what are we going to make for dinner? Like,
Right.
It was like, oh my God, it's never going to stop.
Right. Yeah. I definitely got sick of my own cooking during that time. And I went through a phase where I was ordering stuff online, like getting stuff shipped from all over the country. Cause I was like, well, I'm not going out to eat. Might as well like get some stuff sent here. I was getting ribs from Kansas City. I was getting muffalettas from New Orleans. So that was my sort of temporary stopgap measure.
Right. So I want to back up to the beginning of the podcast. You've talked about how it's evolved over time, but you started a podcast before everyone had a podcast, right? Can you please tell us the origin story? Because the legend is
There's a
that it
legend?
was less about food and more about getting laid off all the time.
Some of both, really. Yes. No, look, I mean, I unlike some of the people who've gotten into podcasting more recently, not all, but some, I came up in the world of audio and radio, and that is what was my first passion. I graduated from college in 1999, and my dream was to host my own radio show. So for me, the podcast was not like the 27th brand extension. But the first 8 or 10 years of my career, I bounced around different radio jobs, producing, some hosting, some reporting. I worked at NPR. I worked at a progressive talk radio network called Air America that was launched in 2004. I was at a couple of stints at Sirius XM. I was, bouncing all around, but I had the sort of bad luck of coming into the field at the same time that the internet and technology were upending all the traditional business models. And there were two major recessions in my first 8 or 10 years out of college. And so those two things combined made an already tumultuous industry even more so. And so I got laid off from 6 jobs in 8 years.
Wow.
And I sort of got to a point where I was like, I got into my 30s, I got getting married, I have kids on the way. It's like, it's not, you can't just be bouncing around every 6 months to a different job at a certain point. I got to a point where I had to decide whether this career was going to work. And around that time, some friends of mine in radio were starting podcasts. I had worked with Mark Maron at Air America Radio, and he started his podcast early on. I was like, hey, it's going great. You should try this. And I had worked on these jobs where I kept getting laid off. Like I would get a job on a show. I would think, this is great. I love this show. I'm going to work really hard. I'll work my way up. And then some executive would cancel the show. And I figured if I start my own podcast, at least nobody can cancel it but me.
Right.
Like these other jobs I had worked so hard at, and then it felt like someone came in from the outside and just pulled the rug out. And I felt like, at least with a podcast, I'll own it. I'll host. I can make myself the host, and I can control it, and nobody can ever take it away from me. And the only way that it will end is if I decide it's going to end. And so at least then, when you're putting in that much work, you don't have that fear that someone's going to come along and pull the rug out.
And so here you are.
That's right.
14 years later.
That's right. But most of my work before that most of my radio work was in news talk radio, some comedy, politics, talk radio, morning shows. When I set out to do a podcast, I was like, all right, what should my podcast be? I was like, well, I've done a lot of stuff in news and politics, but I don't really think the world needs another guy with opinions on politics. I'm a big sports fan, but don't think the world needs another guy talking about that. And I thought, what about food? Like I sort of have an idiosyncratic approach to food. I have a lot of opinions. I'm kind of quirky. When I would go out to eat with friends, we'd go to a diner, and I'd always be like taking my omelet and taking it apart and turning it into a sandwich on an English muffin. And I realized that everyone was watching me. They're all watching me at the table all the time to see what I'm going to do with my food.
Right.
And I was like, maybe this is something, at least this will stand out. It will be different. And I decided to give it a shot.
Well, it's very interesting because you've zeroed in on something that I've noticed listening to it over the years, is that, and maybe when you started, as you said, that was correct that you were an outsider, but on the show, you have a very distinct persona on the show. And I would call it the endlessly curious outsider, kind of not a rube exactly, but yeah, maybe a rube, maybe a little bit of a rube on things. Like there are some questions you ask and I'm like, Dan Pashman, you know the answer to that. So is that the real you? Or is this the Dan Pashman persona?
Is there a specific question you have in mind? Because I can tell you if the answer, if I knew or not.
Oh gosh, that is a good question. I think it was on, and we're going to get to this, your series on making pasta. And oh goodness. Oh, you're putting me on the spot. Hello, editor. Please edit me out. That's not right. Remembering exactly what my question was.
This is a tough thing to throw at someone spur of the moment.
Yeah. Was it? I don't know what semolina was. Semolina flour. I think it was what semolina flour. And I was like, Dan Pashman, you know what semolina flour is.
I mean, the truth is that at the time that I'm recording those lines of narration, I know. But when I went to the North Dakota State University pasta lab to research pasta, I knew that pasta was made from semolina, but I didn't know what semolina was. Like I couldn't tell you, like, oh, they take the germ of the wheat and they crack open the germ wheat and they take. Like I didn't know that. I mean, I think that. Yeah, I mean, I think maybe I really just don't know as much as you're giving me credit for, Jane. I think probably at this point, my food knowledge is like very inconsistent. There are certain things that now I've become a lot more knowledgeable about just from hosting a food podcast for so long and talking to so many folks. And there's certain basic things that I still don't know. Like for the 10th anniversary of the Sporkful, I did an Instagram live where Sola El Whaley taught me how to make a roux. I had never made a roux. Right. I'm like, I've been hosting a James Beard Award winning food podcast for 10 years. I should know how to make a roux. But I've only made a couple since then. I'm still a little bit intimidated by the idea. And that's the truth.
It's a thing. Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I mean, because again, after all these years doing it, you do know all these people and you have had all these experiences. And yet, you're sort of a stand-in for, the passionate food lover for whom this isn't their job.
Right. Well, that's exactly right. That's something that at times I sort of feel insecure about, or like imposter syndrome. Like, oh, who am I to be hosting this show or writing a cookbook or whatever? Like, what do I know? But then at other times I sort of feel like it's a strength, because it informs my perspective in the way that I host the show, is that it makes it accessible and it gives people a way in, which is kind of what I didn't feel like I had when when I started the podcast that I didn't see other people doing, is being the voice of the curious listener who doesn't know as much as the guest.
Right. Yeah. Well, so let's go with that one more step. So you started the podcast, you defined yourself as not a food person. Tell me, how did you grow up? What did you grow up eating? How did you become someone who loved food?
I mean, I definitely grew up in a food obsessed family. My mom was a great cook. We would go out to eat a lot if we traveled. I mean, this was back in the 80s and 90s.
And where did you grow up?
I
Tell
grew
us
up
where
in
you
New
grew up.
Jersey. I grew
Okay.
up in New Jersey, outside New York City suburbs, in a food obsessed family. Definitely, we loved to eat. We went out to eat regularly. And if we were going anywhere on a family trip, back in the 80s and 90s, pre-internet, my mom would have torn out clippings from magazines and pulled out articles into a folder, and she was making reservations and think, what we're going to eat. I remember in the mid 80s, my aunt moved to Houston, and then we went to visit her at about late 80s. And that was when this was before fajitas were kind of everywhere, and I had fajitas on like homemade flour tortillas. And that set off like the great Pashman family fajita craze of the late 80s and early 90s, when there was
I've heard of it. Yes.
always a flank steak marinating in our downstairs refrigerator at all times. We had a lot of fajitas after we got back from that trip. My parents had a party once where they got like a barbecue truck. And this was, again, like sort of before barbecue was so national. Like in New Jersey, to have a Texas, quote unquote, Texas barbecue party was like very novel. And they found some guy with a barbecue truck who would like pull it into your driveway and dish out ribs. We had, it was always very food centric, and holidays, family gatherings. I grew up in a Jewish family, so Jewish holidays, brisket, or Yom Kippur breakfast, bagels and lox. Food was always
And
a focus.
were you part of the actual cooking?
Sometimes. I mean, I remember, I learned to cook scrambled eggs at a pretty young age. I can remember my brother and me making like egg and cheese sandwiches, Canadian bacon, egg and cheese on English muffins on weekend mornings. I wasn't really cooking dinner for the family. I had a sort of few things that I knew how to make, but my mom cooked, and so I was more focused on eating than cooking growing up.
Right, right. And today, what does Dan Pashman today do for cooking? Like, what do you cook for dinner on a Tuesday night? What are you cooking tonight for dinner, if you're cooking?
Well, tonight I think we're going out. There's a happy hour down the road where you can get a burger and a beer for $10. And my wife and I have decided we're going to teach our kids about happy hour.
Excellent,
Yeah.
excellent parenting.
But yeah, before COVID, I used to go into the city to work more. And so probably my wife and I split the cooking about 50-50. Now I do probably more of it still, because I don't go in the city as much. I love to cook. I love to cook especially when I have the time. So we have 2 daughters, ages 13 and 10. They're passionate eaters too. They'll help me in the kitchen sometimes. A lot, I cook a lot of different pasta dishes, certainly like a lot of roast and grilled chicken. A lot of, I'm trying to think, what are some other sort of, I usually, we do like Shabbat dinner, Jewish Shabbat dinners Friday night, sort of and so Saturday morning we'll have leftover challah, like Jewish bread, and I'll do challah French toast on Saturday mornings usually. But then it's just kind of like whatever is in the freezer. I kind of like the game of like, what do we have? What can we make? Or like we had friends over, like a sort of 3 families over for a Sunday afternoon, light the fireplace, chill out. And I made spam masubi, which I'd made once before, and that was a big hit. And I did like,
Can you explain to people what that is?
So that's it's a Hawaiian dish that's like spam cooked in a pan, and you do like a glaze. I did a glaze with, it has soy sauce and brown sugar and mirin. I just got the recipe from New York Times for the sauce. You glaze it, and then it's just like sushi rice, furikake wrapped in like a nori, like a seaweed wrapper. And my kids love that, and my kids help me roll them, and so that's really fun. We've done homemade sushi too, and it's I love interactive stuff with the kids. Is really fun. So I made those, and then I made some grilled chicken sliders. I did like grilled chicken thighs that I seasoned with Ileana Masonette's Sazon from Burlap and Barrel, which is phenomenal, and grilled those up and put them on some potato rolls, the slider potato rolls with mango chutney and pickled red onions that I pickled myself, which I
Ooh.
was very proud of. That was like, Jane, when I think of an idea like that on my own without looking at the recipe, I feel very proud of myself, even though that for a real chef, it's extremely basic. But when I was like, this sandwich will be better if there's something acidic and crunchy, I thought I could do pickles. And I was like, wait a second, I know how to pickle red onions. And I did that, and I was very proud.
Yes, I do like the game. I do like the game of what's in the fridge and what can I make with it. I need to get better at that. That I think I've always felt is the sign of a true cook. You can be a good cook, but being able to look in the fridge and say, I see how to piece this all together.
Right. But see,
And
I
anyone can
rarely,
show up.
right. But see, like, I rarely follow recipes. I'm much more, but like, this is just my personality. I took piano lessons when I was a kid, and from like 2 days in, I wanted to write my own songs. I just I was never good at following directions. I don't like copying what other people have done. I always want to I have always felt driven to try to make my own version of something or create something, even if it's not as good as it would have been if I had followed a recipe. I rarely will follow a recipe unless it's really like an ingredient, or there's just something I'm working with that I really am not comfortable with or haven't worked with before. Typically I like to make it up as I go.
Okay. You have just set me up so perfectly for my next question,
All right, great. Love when
which
that
is,
happens.
are you ready? Drum roll,
Yes.
please.
All right.
You spent 3 years making your own pasta shape.
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect
Again,
example.
what a good example. Plenty of pasta shapes out there, Dan.
Yeah.
Plenty of very good ones.
Yeah.
For people who have not listened, Dan documented this in a 5-part series on the Sporkful, which was called Mission Impossible. We do
Yep.
love our puns. So tell me why you did this, and then we'll get to what you learned. But tell me what pushed you to do this, because I know at the beginning everyone was like, Dan, this is a bad idea.
Yes. My wife, that's what my wife said. She said, why are you doing this? There's already enough pasta shapes. It was sort of a couple of things coming together to motivate me. One was, at that point, I had been doing the Sporkful podcast, for 7 or so years. And the podcast boom had come, and there were all these sort of long form podcasts like Serial, like Alex Bloomberg's Startup, that were multi-part stories told over multiple episodes with a lot of sort of drama and long form, like a Netflix drama, but in audio, and that was exciting. And I was like, what would my version of that be? And in particular, Alex Bloomberg did a series called Startup about the creation of his podcast company. And it's sort of like a person on a quest to launch a business.
But which he sold for what, tens, hundreds of millions of dollars. I hope you have $100 million for this pasta.
I don't, but I'm still very proud of it anyway.
Okay, sorry. Go on. I'll keep you focused.
I didn't do as well as Alex on my project, but he did.
But
his
pasta's more important. Pasta's essential, and I can say that because Jose's not here to tell us that Spanish food is better. Okay, go on.
So I just. I was like, what would my version of a long form story on the podcast be? And inspired by Startup, I was like, what if I started some kind of a business? What if I invented a food? So that was like the first thought. And then it was like, okay, I like this idea. I want to tell this story on the show. What should the food be? And then my criteria were, well, I want it to be a food that when it comes out, Sporkful listeners all over the country, at least, if not the world, can order it. I don't want it to be something that's only going to be in a few like boutique-y stores in trendy neighborhoods.
Right.
So that means it has to be shelf stable and easily shipped, and it has to be relatively inexpensive. And so that led me in the direction of pasta because it checks those boxes. And then I started thinking, I was like, there's a lot of mediocre pasta shapes out there. Like a lot of them are just fine, but they're not great.
No offense, Granny, but we can do better.
And so I came up with these 3 metrics that I use to judge all pasta shapes. So they're forkability, which is how easy is it to get the pasta shape on your fork and keep it there. Sauceability, which is how well does the sauce adhere. And tooth sinkability, which is how satisfying is it to sink your teeth into it. And there's a lot of shapes that are good at 1 or 2 of those, right, but very few nail all 3. And especially some of those popular ones like spaghetti. It's very hard to get a good bite on your fork. It holds no sauce. It's not especially satisfying to bite into unless it's a very high quality spaghetti and cooked just right. And it's like the most popular shape. Why? It's only the most popular because it's like the oldest. It's the oldest mass produced shape. So it's like, but it's very primitive. So why are we stuck with this very primitive shape that everyone's eating when we could be doing something so much better?
See, this is what I like about you in the Sporkful. I just have to add, I like the way you're just really righteous about this, right? It's like no one else ever really considered it, but I'm like, I've got my list and I've got my things, and I'm going to get up here and I'm going to make my case
That's right.
against spaghetti.
Steve Jobs has a famous line that people paraphrase often to the effect of, don't give the people what they want. Give the people something that they didn't know they wanted.
Right.
And that was like very motivating to me because I was like, I think that once I really get people to think deeply about pasta shapes and what makes some better than others, they'll stop and realize how mediocre a lot of them are and what mediocrity they've been putting up with for so long. And then they'll have this revelation. And I felt that if I could get people to think deeply about pasta shapes, that they would come along for that revelation.
Okay, so I'm going to do a little spoiler here and say that your pasta shape, which ended up being called cascatelli, was Time Magazine's best invention of the year. So that's amazing. Congratulations. You succeeded. Tell
Thank
us
you.
just a little bit about just a quick overview, because we'll ask people to listen to the show, but about what this shape looks like. Describe the shape for us and why you think it does those jobs.
Yeah, so it's a little hard to describe in audio. If you Google cascatelli, you can see the Wikipedia page, but it's a short shape. It's curled. If you look at it from the side, it almost looks like a comma or like half a heart, as you would draw a heart. And on the kind of what I could call the outside or sort of the spine, there are two parallel ruffles sticking up. So you have a flat curl and then two parallel ruffles sticking up out of it. And so those ruffles are perpendicular to the flat curl. And so the ruffles there's like a canyon between those two ruffles that I call the sauce trough. And sauce goes inside there and it cannot get out. And so it's like this deep well. And the ruffles, first of all, ruffles are just fun to have in your mouth. In my research, what I did was I said, I went out and ate like every obscure pasta shape I could get my teeth on. And one of the ones that I was reminded how much I love is mafalda, which is like fettuccine, but with ruffles along the edges. Mm-hmm. And I was like, more pasta shapes should have ruffles. Everyone talks about tubes holding sauce, but ruffles hold a lot of sauce. They also hold bits and pieces very well. And they're just fun and playful in your mouth. So I said, I want ruffles. And these ruffles on the cascatelli, they're fun and playful in your mouth. And the space between them holds a ton of sauce. And it just so happens, this was kind of honestly mostly luck, the spot where the ruffle strip meets the flat strip cooks ever so slightly less than the rest of the pasta. It's a little bit denser and firmer. It doesn't cook unevenly. It's just a subtle difference, but that subtle difference creates variable textures within the shape, which makes an especially satisfying bite, and especially tooth-sinkable bite.
I have to say, so I cooked them up 2 nights ago. I made 2 different sauces. One was kind of a tomato-based kind of tuna pasta, tuna with red sauce and olives and capers. Made that for my husband and me. And though my daughter is a very good eater, I made her just cheese and olive oil, just so we could have 2 different ways that weren't really 2 different ways. I had to make 2 different sauces. Pasta test with flying colors. My daughter was like, yes, I do note a bit of differential texture here. I was like, good girl.
That's
so
awesome.
Yeah, it was really fun. It was really fun. And again, does the world need it? I don't know. Was it wonderful and fun? And did we enjoy it? Yes. And in today's world, I think that's good enough, don't you?
For sure. I mean, look, if we're gonna restrict ourselves to only creating things that the world truly needs, it's gonna be a pretty boring world.
Absolutely. Okay, well, we're going to keep talking about pasta again, Jose, off on another continent, so we can do this. You have a new book out, which is also about pasta. Tell us why the world needs this cookbook, or doesn't know that it needs this cookbook.
Well, so when Cascatelli came out, it went viral. It was very exciting. Now it's in stores all over the country. The original version is made by Sfolini. You can order it online, or they have it at Whole Foods and a bunch of other stores. Um, and they were selling out of it like crazy, and everyone was ordering it, and they were all sending me pictures of what people were cooking with it. And I was, it was very exciting to get all these pictures and all this response, but like overwhelmingly what the pictures I was getting were like tomato sauce, meat sauce, mac and cheese, a few party animals made pesto.
Right.
And I was like, there's so much more, and it just occurred to me, as much as there are other recipes out there, there are other dishes. I just think that most Americans have a pretty limited set of sauces that they put with pasta shapes. They have a limited set of shapes and a little limited set of sauces and preparations. And to me, pasta is like a blank canvas. I mean, there's almost nothing that you can't adapt into a pasta sauce. So I said, I want to set out to do a cookbook that's going to show people that there are so many more things they can and should be putting on pasta.
Right. I mean, it's an interesting thing because obviously noodles are international and, in different cultures the same way that rice is. But somehow when we think of pasta, it's Italian. Is that because pasta is Italian and noodles are not? I mean, have you thought about this culturally, why that's the case?
I haven't thought a ton about why. I mean, other than, to me, noodles are such a bigger world. Like the world of Asian noodles is so much more vast and diverse because there are so many different cuisines represented, and there's so many different types of noodles made from different ingredients. And so like, it's just like there's so much more variety there, and so many more different cultures and different people who had opportunities to evolve and come up with new ideas. Whereas like pasta culture tends to be mostly focused on Italy. And so that's just sort of like, first of all, just a smaller group of people as compared to all Asian cultures and all noodle cultures. So there's just sort of less going on. And there's also just kind of like a very, an attitude in Italian food culture that is a little bit unfair, I think. And we get to that in the cookbook, but that like sort of, this is the traditional way and you shouldn't vary, you shouldn't deviate from it. And I think that also sort of may have reduced the variety. That being said, like there's a lot more variety in pasta in Italy than there is in America.
Right.
Well, so the
American
American pasta dish is very much informed by the Southern Italians who came en masse to America in the late 18 and early 1900s. And kind of like a lot of the other regions and the other dishes and other ingredients that are well known in Italy, kind of like a lot of Americans didn't get the memo.
Yeah, I'm going to pause just here for 1 second because you're a radio person and say, like, I don't feel like I asked that question quite right.
Okay.
Um, I don't really know what the question is. Maybe you're a smart enough podcaster to help me figure out what the question is. It's more like, I guess what I was trying to get at is like, is pasta Italian? Because you do use noodles. I don't really know what I'm saying here because you do use noodles in Asian cultures. So are the noodles used in Asian cultures not pasta, and pasta is only Italian?
Oh.
And I should probably rephrase that question so you can answer it. But is that the right question?
I mean, it sounds like what you're sort of asking is like, what's the difference between pasta and noodles?
Well, yeah, because, as I said, like we use rice across all of these different cuisines and cultures, but we think of pasta as Italian, even though obviously noodles have been used across different cultures. So is pasta Italian? And then what you're saying is use Italian pasta to make things that aren't just Italian?
Right. I mean, I guess, yeah, I don't know.
Maybe it's just a bad question. I don't know.
I mean, I think I get what you're saying. I mean, I don't really know. I don't know that I have a good answer for you, though. To be honest, I don't.
Right.
I don't know why it is that we tend that we have this mentality that these two foods are distinct when in reality they're sort of like cousins.
Right.
It may be in part they're just sort of like European foods tend to get treated differently in American culture and a lot of world cultures than foods associated with people of color. So that could be one factor. Like I said, the fact that there's so much more diversity in the world of Asian noodles than there is in Italian, because there's so many more different food cultures. Asia is kind of the idea of Asian Americans is a bit of a false construct. Like there's so many different distinct cultures within that group, whereas Italian is a little bit more specific. So yeah,
Right. But what you're doing in your book, though, is taking sort of the classic American Italian pastas and using them with lots of different with sauces that are not traditional.
That's right. I mean, my basic attitude was that like we eat a ton of pasta in America, and a lot of people are eating kind of mediocre pasta shapes with the same old sauces. And I love a good tomato sauce, but I mean, like, there's just so much more. And I don't think the world needed another recipe for tomato sauce. That's for sure.
Is there a recipe for tomato sauce in your book?
No, there is not.
No,
there's no recipe for tomato sauce. In fact, I encourage people to use jarred sauce because there's so many good jarred tomato sauces out there. And I even have a jarred tomato sauce decision tree. So you can take a jar of sauce, go through the decision tree, and it will give you more than a dozen different options of things that you can add to the jar of sauce to doctor it, whether you want to make it heartier or spicier or crispier or change it in some way, a million different ways. But the world doesn't need another recipe for tomato sauce. So yeah, I just feel like pasta, in a similar way that like rice and noodles, like they're all sort of like it's a carb base, and there's a lot of different things that you can put on it that are going to be delicious.
Right. Tell us about one more recipe that you have in there. I did love this. I'm try that again. I do love the sauce decision tree. But tell me about one of the pastas you have in there that that uses the cascatelli. That's got a sort of lob on it. What was the inspiration for that dish, and what is it?
Yeah, so
just to give people an example of the different ways you're thinking about it.
One example. So this is, a lot of the way that I was thinking through the different dishes is sort of like, all right, a lot of people eat bolognese. A lot of people eat meat sauce, right? It's got ground meat, but there's a million other ground meat dishes in other cultures that could be mashed up with the idea of a basic meat sauce. So we have a keema bolognese, for instance, that takes the traditional Indian dish keema with Indian spices and mashes that up with a bolognese to make it spicy and more South Asian variation. The one you're referring to, so like if I order Thai food at a restaurant, like lab is one of the go-tos, spicy ground meat. I usually get pork, sometimes beef, but it's going to be spicy, tangy, a big squeeze of lemon juice on top. Big squeeze of lime juice on top. Usually it's served with some kind of green, like a lettuce. You put it in the lettuce, you chomp it up. It's crunchy, it's spicy. I love it. But I was like, it's a ground meat dish. Couldn't we take some of the same spices and adapt it to be like a ground meat pasta sauce? And so I worked with a recipe developer named James Park, an old friend of mine who's great. And, he and I worked together on it. I said, what do you think of this idea? He said, I love it. So it's not the same as eating lob, but it is, we called it lob-ish cascatelli. It's like inspired by it. A lot of the same flavors. If you love lob, then you're going to love this pasta dish. And that's kind of a lot of what we're trying to do with the cookbook.
Yeah, I think that's really fun. And I think it's great because, the biggest challenge with cooking at home is getting stuck in a rut, right? You kind of have, whether it's just tomato sauce with pasta or just whatever you make, and it gets boring. And so sometimes you get a chef recipe that is too hard to try at home, but really you just need a new idea to break out.
100%. And I think pasta, especially because it's inexpensive, because it's so easy to make, it's especially apt to be the food that you go to when you're in a rut, because like it's just so basic and so simple, and it's everywhere all the time, and almost everyone in your family will eat it. And so you just stop thinking about it. You stop putting effort into it because it's your basic weeknight go-to. And with just a little bit of effort, you could open up this whole universe of new and exciting flavors.
Right. So I have two more questions, and then I have two more questions. One is just to sort of back up and away from pasta, which is just looking at Americans and food today. We're talking about how we eat, how we get stuck in ruts. Statistically, Americans are cooking a lot less than they did in years past. And that's partially because there are a lot of options and partially because we're all too busy. But they still love to hear about food and cooking, and they still love to watch food and cooking. Food really is entertainment, and I'm not the first person to suggest this. This has been around for a while. I'm wondering why you think that is. I'm wondering why you think that is, and also, you know, whether it's important to get people cooking again.
You're asking why do people continue to turn to food for entertainment even though they're cooking
Yeah.
less?
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I think it's probably a couple of factors. I think that when you show people delicious food, they're going to be interested. You know what I mean? Like, it's very visceral. Even if you're not cooking it, it's just sort of taps into something very deep that you're like, oh my God, I want to eat that. It's also just, it's a universal thing. We all eat. Even if you don't cook much, you eat, you know, and so it's sort of like it's one of the most, it just taps into like some of the most basic parts of being human. And so I think that there's that. And then I'd also just think there's just this, if you look at cookbooks from 100 years ago, they're like, here's a trick. I mean, it doesn't quite say it this way, but it's like, here's a hot tip. Here's, you know, for doing this faster. Like, it's just always, you know, the idea of sort of optimizing and is like sort of new, but also universal and timeless. Like, people are always looking for tricks to do things more efficiently and better. And when it's something that people are doing that everyone does, it makes it that much more accessible.
Right. Right. Interesting. Okay. So last question for you.
Yes.
Last question for you. What are you going to invent next?
I mean, you know, there's a pretty hot item in the cookbook that I'm very excited about. You know, invent is a strong word because everything builds upon something that came before. Thomas Edison used to say he's not an inventor, he's a perfecter. And I sort of feel that way too. But I have a dish in the cookbook called pasta pizza. And this came to me while I was driving. I had been reading other people's cookbooks for inspiration. And I saw this recipe in Ali Slagle's cookbook, I Dream of Dinner, where she takes a short pasta shape and she puts it on a sheet pan. It's already cooked pasta, but she puts it on a sheet pan with some sauce and puts it in the oven. And the sheet pan gives it crispy edges. And I love crispy edges. So I was like, that's genius. And then I thought, what if I were to, like, would it be possible to take cooked, like boiled cooked fettuccine and put that on a sheet pan, a long pasta? And if you did that, let's say you added some oil and then, like, would it, if you put that in the oven, would it turn crispy on the bottom? Would the whole thing, would it cohere? Would it become a cohesive whole? And if so, like, it's sort of then a pasta crust. And could you top it like, what? It's sort of then like a pizza crust. And like, could you then top it like a pizza and put sauce and cheese on top and then cut squares out and pick it up and eat it with your hands? And I got very excited about this idea. And I thought, if this is possible, it's going to be so much fun and it's going to look cool. And so it took a lot of testing, a lot of help from my kids, but we did it. We created pasta pizza. It's incredible. You can top it just like a pizza. And I think it's a ton of fun.
Oh my God, it's the new cronut.
Yeah, exactly.
Even though you don't want to really invent the new cronut, but you do, kind of. That's amazing.
Yeah, so I'm super excited about that one. Beyond that, I have a lot of opinions about tortilla chip shapes. So if anyone out there is a tortilla chip manufacturer and you want to collab, call me.